So we are looking at the Rambam Perek Ches Mihilchos Tshuva, and Perek Ches seems to be a bit of a departure from the theme. He does not talk about Tshuva anymore. He talks about what you might call, in a superficial way, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, meaning to say the result of your Tshuva and the result of your mitzvos is that you get this existence that is called the world to come, Olam Haba, which the Rambam then proceeds to define, and it's very, very important that one remembers that the Rambam's definition is that Olam Haba is a totally spiritual existence. There is no eating, there is no drinking, there is no body, there is no intimacy relationships between people. It is the world of the soul. It is the Olam HaNeshamos. And if you wonder what's so great about that, the Rambam says that because we are physical creatures, we generally only understand physical pleasure. But in reality, this is the greatest possible pleasure, the union of your essence with its source, which is God. And there is no pleasure that is as great as that. This is what Pirkei Avos says, that 1 second of Olam Haba is greater than all of the pleasures of Olam Hazah. And as Rav Dessler was masberet, he said, take all of the pleasures from the beginning of time to the end of time, multiply it by all of the people who ever lived and had those pleasures, right? So all of the pleasure, if you could quantify it, 1 second of Olam Haba is greater. Olam Haba is eternal. Remember, this is a point that I've made many, many times, that punishment seems to be limited. Olam Haba is eternal. There's a certain asymmetry in punishment and reward. Now, there are going to be a number of questions here, but the most important point is simply to remember that the Rambam says Olam Haba is not a physical place, and even though Chazal describe it in physical ways. They talk about the wild ox and the Leviathan, and you will drink wine from grapes, right? You've seen, you will drink wine from grapes in which the wine has been stored from the 6 days of creation, and golden thrones and rivers of balsam oil, right? Many, many physical descriptions, but the Rambam says these are simply metaphors for us to try to comprehend on some level the great, great pleasure of Olam Haba, because we simply don't understand what it would be otherwise. Now, the Ravid, right, Rav Avram ben David, right, the Ravid was one of the great Gedolim. In fact, it's interesting, the Rambam actually refers to the Ravid in a letter. I mean, the Rambam, I don't know if they met in person, but the Rambam knew of the Ravid, although I don't know if the Rambam knew of the Ravid's criticisms. And he wrote about the Ravid in very, very positive ways. He says the great, great rabbi in France. Rav Avram ben David lived in France. The Rambam lived in Egypt. But the Ravid wrote many, many things. It's almost unfortunate that when people think of the Ravid, they only think of him in his critical capacity, in which he argues with the Rambam. The Ravid wrote many, 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 many things, but he is most famous for his fairly biting critique of the Mishnah Torah, in which he went over it line by line by line by line, and when he didn't like what he read, he was pretty open about not liking it. He'll say, waste of time, waste of paper, better people than him disagree, whatever. But these are called the hasagos, the criticisms of the Ravid, and they seem to be, they're usually relatively short. So the Ravid says on here, Divrei ha'ish hazeh b'einai. I mean, this itself is kind of a little disrespectful. The words of this guy, this man, Kerovim, are very close to saying there's no such thing as resurrection of the dead. There is only the soul. And the Ravid says, Chaye Reishi, I swear by the life of my head, Lo hoya das Chazal al zeh, this was not the view of Chazal. So here is the problem. In other words, the Ravid is actually very, very accurate in the following. If I read the Rambam's description of the reward that we get for mitzvos, And the Rambam says the reward that we get for mitzvos is Olam Haba. And Olam Haba is not, there's no body, it's totally spiritual. There is no mention whatsoever in this chapter of something called resurrection of the dead, or as we call it, Techias Hameisim. So the Ravid says, what's going on here? Why does the Rambam not mention resurrection of the dead? Could it be that the Rambam says there's no such thing as physical resurrection of the dead? All there is survival of the soul, right? That is a possibility. Philosophers have made that argument. Philosophers have argued, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that the soul is eternal, the body decomposes, and there's no such thing as resurrection of the physical body. There is only the soul. So the Ravid is looking at this passage in the Rambam, and the Ravid is saying, this sounds pretty close to the position that there is no physical resurrection of the body, there is only survivability of the soul, assuming he gets a share in Olam Haba. And the Ravid goes on and says, this is certainly not the position of Chazal, who talk about physical resurrection of the body as well. Now, in truth, the Rambam was accused of this constantly. Many, many people did accuse the Rambam of not believing in physical resurrection, because when the Rambam discusses the ultimate reward of mitzvos, the Rambam always mentions Olam Haba, which is specifically not physical. The Rambam, because of this, and the Rambam was accused of being an apikoros. The Rambam was accused of being a heretic. The Rambam was accused of not believing in the fundamental principles of the Jewish faith. The Rambam had quite a few people that criticized him on different points, and this is one of the major criticisms. And because of this, the Rambam actually wrote a public letter, that was to be read in different synagogues, different places. And this is called Mamar. Well, it was written in Arabic, but later translated into Hebrew. And this is called Mamar Techias Hameisim, an essay on resurrection of the dead, where the Rambam, in sometimes in a tone that is quite angry and kind of annoyed, says, of course I believe in physical resurrection. And he gives us some very excellent proofs for this, because the Rambam says, look at my 13 principles of faith, right? The Yud Gimel Ikre Emuna, that are, now again, let me just give you some information about that. The Rambam identified 13 principles of faith that in order to be a believing Jew, you have to subscribe to. Now, we know most of these by the formula, Ani Ma'amin Bi'amunah Shalem. If you look in a siddur after Shachris, some people say them, it's not part of the siddur per se, but it begins with a profession of faith that says, Ani Ma'amin Bi'amunah Shalema. I believe in perfect faith that there's one God, etc., etc., etc. Now, I want to point out to you, and I think I've said it before, the actual words of that, Ani Ma'amin Bi'amunah Shalema, etc., are not the Rambam's words. The Rambam did not write those words. The author of those words, the author of those formulations is anonymous. It is based on what the Rambam formulated in his commentary on the Mishnah, the introduction to the last parak of Sanhedrin, which talks about Olam Haba. So the Rambam articulated in more philosophical language 13 principles of faith. And the Ani Ma'amin Bi'amunah Shlema was some anonymous person's adaptation of the Rambam's bit more complicated formulation to make it a simpler type of reading, right? So contrary to what many people think, the Rambam is not the author of Ani Ma'amin. By the same token, there's a poem that appears in the siddur that many shuls sing Friday night, and some people say every day. Actually, it's in the siddur, in the part of davening you say every day. and that is Yigdal Elokim Chai, right? I glorify the living God. If you look at Yigdal, and I hope you can notice this, you will actually see it is a poetic rendition of the 13 principles of faith. Okay, so the Ani Mamins and the Yigdal are renditions of the Rambam's principles, but they are not the Rambam's exact language. The only exact language of the Rambam you will find in the introduction to Perek Chelik. And even that's not the exact language because the Rambam wrote the Perush Mishnayos in Arabic. So if you're reading it in Hebrew, you are reading a translation of the Rambam's words, not exactly the Rambam's own words. Okay? Now, what the Rambam points out, you're telling me I don't believe in physical resurrection of the dead? What is my 13th principle? Ani ma'amin be'evunu shlema b'tchias Hameisim. I believe, well, not the Ani ma'amin, but whatever the Rambam wrote, I believe in Techias Hameisim. So number one, in the Perush Mishnayos, the Rambam says beferish, there will be physical resurrection. And number two, in Hilchos Tshuva itself, in Perek Gimel, if you remember, we looked at that a while ago. Perek Gimel lists the different people who don't have a share in Olam Haba. Remember, the Rambam's general approach is even if you're a Rasha, even if you have many more Averos than mitzvahs, after you get your punishment in Gehenna, you go to Olam Haba. You don't forfeit the good because of the bad. But the Rambam did say there are certain crimes, so to speak, that are so heinous that you lose Olam Haba and you have obliteration. And these are mainly theological errors, like not believing in God or whatever. And one of them is listed in Perek Gimel, a person who denies resurrection of the dead. So the Rambam writes in his letter, how can you dare accuse me of not believing in physical resurrection if, number one, I listed physical resurrection as a fundamental principle of faith, and number two, I listed denial of resurrection as a basis for not getting Olam Haba. So what are you accusing me of? Okay, that's fair enough. But here's the big problem. It's still the case that in Perek Ches of Hilchos Tshuva, where the Rambam is telling us what is the ultimate reward for mitzvahs. What is the reward? What is the end game? The Rambam does not mention resurrection of the dead. He only mentions the spiritual world of Olam Haba. So you still have a question. How does the Rambam view resurrection of the dead? He got to believe in it because he himself says he believes in it. And yet he does not incorporate it as the ultimate reward for divine commandments. So in a sense, I can understand why the Ravid is intimating, maybe the Rambam doesn't really believe in physical resurrection, why other people did it, etc. So we have to understand, in light of the Rambam's explicit acceptance of resurrection of the dead, why does he totally eliminate it from his description of the reward that you get for your mitzvahs? Yeah.
Oh, when the Rambam wrote in Arabic, was it Arabic words in Hebrew letters, or was it actually quoting them?
Yeah, the Rambam wrote it in Hebrew letters. Yeah, it's called Judeo-Arabic. Yeah, so I mean, the Rambam obviously knew how to write in Arabic, but all of his Arabic works are in Hebrew letters, and they were then translated into Hebrew. And the Rambam's favorite translator was Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibon. I mean, the Rambam himself authorized Rav Shmuel ibn Tibon to translate his works. And it's very interesting, by the way, just as a little aside, we actually have a letter of Shmuel ibn Tibon, did the Perush of Mishnayos, did the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. And we actually have correspondence where Rav Shmuel ibn Tibon asked the Rambam about different words in the Moreh Nevuchim and how they should be translated into Hebrew. So the Rambam was a little involved in the translation aspect as well. And the Rambam gives a very interesting advice to a translator. This is very fascinating. He said, a translator from one language to another language should not translate literally, word for word, an exact order of words, because different languages have different ways words are organized. And sometimes, moreover, something that is expressed in one word in one language may require several words in another language, and vice versa. Something that is expressed in the original language with several words is best expressed in the translating language in a single word. So his advice to a translator, not everybody agrees, but this is the Rambam's own advice regarding how to translate his works, is you need to fully understand the meaning of what you're reading. Go over it, go over it, go over it. Be sure you understand it. And after you understand it, then express it in your words in the best way that you can. Now, we would actually call that paraphrasing. We wouldn't even call that translation. But the Rambam said people who translate overly literally are just going to confuse the readers because the organization of languages are different. In fact, this, by the way, was a problem. I'll give you a modern example of this problem. So many of you, I hope, may occasionally learn the commentary of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Beautiful, beautiful commentary on the Chumash. Now, he first lived in the 19th century. He wrote his commentary in German. And the first translation of the Hirsch Chumash, which is still widely available, many people find very difficult to read. And the reason is because German, if you know the German language at all, German is a very heavy, ponderous language in which everything is flowery and dramatic, and an English reader can get very impatient reading long German sentences translated into English. It just goes on too long. English is a briefer language, although you wouldn't necessarily know that, but compared to German, English expresses things in a shorter way. So as a result, Rav Hirsch's commentary has been retranslated in a more colloquialized way, less literal to the German, and as a result, it's much easier to read than it was. And this is what the Rambam was suggesting to Shmuel ibn Tibon. Okay, that's a way of digression. But now back to the fundamental problem. And that is, what's going on with resurrection here? Does he believe in it or doesn't he believe in it? You see the problem. On one hand, physical resurrection is listed in the 13 Principles of Faith. Okay. And in addition, denial of resurrection is listed in Perek Gimel as not having a share in the world to come. So those are the two arguments that the Rambam, of course, believed in resurrection of the dead. But the counter argument is, in Perek Ches, when the Rambam is discussing the afterlife, and the Rambam is discussing the ultimate reward of all mitzvahs, there is not a single mention of resurrection of the dead. There is only a mention of Olam Haba, and in that description of Olam Haba, the Rambam makes a point that there is no body, there is no physicality, there is no eating or drinking. So which is it? We seem to have two different views as to the Rambam's approach to Techias Hameisim. So here, to really understand this, we have to analyze a fundamental machlokes between Rambam, Maimonides, and Ramban, Nachmanides, regarding resurrection of the dead. I am going to start with Ramban first, because although we're learning Rambam, Ramban's view is the view that's most widely accepted and the one that's most commonly articulated. Because we're going to see the Rambam has a very unique view about resurrection of the dead. According to Ramban, we start off like the Rambam. When a person dies and they go through the Gehenna or whatever they need to go through, they go to Olam Haba. Olam Haba is spiritual. Olam Haba is not physical, etc. But Olam Haba is not the end game. At some point after Mashiach comes, it may be a year after Mashiach comes, it may be 10,000 years after Mashiach comes. We don't have a timetable on that. There is going to be physical resurrection of the dead. That means, in other words, Olam Haba is going to be emptied out like a holding pattern. Right? All of those souls in Olam Haba are going to be reunited with physical bodies. And in a sense, this world will become Olam Haba, meaning all of the joy, all of the connection to God that the disembodied soul experienced in Olam Haba will now be experienced with a re-embodied soul, in which body and soul partake of the glory of the Shekhinah. So according to Ramban, Techias Hameisim is the end game. Olam Haba is where the souls go until the time of physical resurrection. But at some point in time, there'll be physical resurrection, and effectively, that becomes Olam Haba. Olam Haba is going to be empty. There's not going to be a place for disembodied souls. There won't be disembodied souls. There'll be a complete union of body and soul, which will then have the ultimate eternal connection with God in this world, which effectively becomes Olam Haba. Right? So as a result, therefore, Olam Haba is, according to Ramban, a temporary stage for the soul until we achieve completion of the process, which is physical resurrection. Now, we don't know, it'll be after Mashiach, but we don't know how long, meaning there may be many, 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 many years of Mashiach. Mashiach will die, etc., be replaced by son of Mashiach. There'll be many, many, many years until there's resurrection of the dead, or maybe not. But eventually, according to Ramban, once there's Techias Hameisim, that is forever. That is forever and ever. That is eternal. So obviously, according to the Ramban, Techias Hameisim is indeed the ultimate reward for our mitzvahs. The ultimate reward of our mitzvahs is to have devekos with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the eternity of Techias Hameisim. That's Ramban. Rambam has a very, very, very different view of resurrection. He says, when you die, you go to Olam Haba, and that's your eternity, and that's your soul, and that's your reward, and there's no physicality there. But at some point, and again, after Mashiach comes, we don't know how long, God is going to do a miracle, just like splitting the Red Sea. And God is going to unite body and soul to show that God can override death. But that's a temporary phenomenon, the Rambam says. Those resurrected people will die. Meaning God will do this great miracle of mass resurrection. And they'll live 70 years or 100 years, whatever it is. Then they're going to die, and that's it. And the only thing that's eternal is Olam Haba. In other words, according to the Rambam, this is very strange. According to the Rambam, Techias Hameisim is not an end stage at all. Techias Hameisim is something God's going to do, and they're going to die. And the only thing that's eternal is the spiritual world of Olam Haba. So now you understand, in a way, why the Rambam had no reason to mention Techias Hameisim in Perek Ches. Perek Ches is talking about the eternal reward for the people who have kept God's mitzvahs. The eternal reward, according to Rambam, is Olam Haba. Techias Hameisim happens to be an event that will happen in the Messianic era, But listen, the Rambam is not discussing the whole Messianic era here. He discusses that in Hilchos Malach. So this is the Rambam's own defense. This is what he explains in his Igeris Techias Hameisim. Well, yeah, of course I believe in physical resurrection, but it's not part of the eternal reward system. So, okay, so the question that we're going to be left with, and maybe I'll talk about it tomorrow at more length, is, so what's the point of it? Meaning, why is it even important? Meaning to say like this. According to Ramban, the union of body and soul is the ultimate way that God will reward us for the good that we've done. In many, many ways, another way of looking at it is, it's the return to the Garden of Eden. In other words, the whole circle of human history. We're back to day one, meaning body and soul in the Garden of Eden. And then we sinned and we brought death into the world and the separation of body and soul. And all of the thousands of years that have passed and the thousands of years that may still pass are an attempt to get back to the Garden of Eden. And Techias Hameisim, the union of body and soul with communion with Hashem. Communion is not only a Christian term, by the way. I mean, Jews can use communion also. Communion just means connection, togetherness with God. Body and soul in communion, in connection with Hashem, is the return to Gan Eden. And that's the eternity. So like Ramban, we understand why Techias Hameisim is a wonderful thing. It's the return to Gan Eden. But if you're going to look like the way the Rambam uses it, God's going to show he has power over death, bring them alive, then they're going to die. And the only thing that really matters is Olam Haba. So the Rambam protected himself, meaning the Rambam formalistically believes in resurrection of the dead. Okay, he's covered. But the question is, what is the big point of it? God is just doing another miracle? Why would it be that important if it's not part of the ultimate reward? So that's going to be the question that we're going to have to address, and that is, the Rambam has a very, very idiosyncratic, unique definition of Techias Hameisim. The question is, according to the Rambam, why does that have importance? That's going to be the issue we're going to have to address. Okay? But at least you have a good answer why he doesn't mention it in Perek Ches. Perek Ches is talking about ultimate eternal reward. According to Rambam, Techias Hameisim is not ultimate eternal reward. Therefore, that is not the subject of what he's talking about in Perek Ches. Okay? So we'll see you tomorrow.